Okay, are we ready to go, Avisha? Right, so we also have a dedicated session on prints and multiples. And when I started preparing for this, I remembered this publication by David Krut Publishing, and it's called Deborah Bell's Alchemy. And I think, yeah?
Your screen isn't shared.
Oh, okay, sorry. One moment.
No problem.
How about that?
Yep, now I can see it.
Okay, right. When I started preparing for the Prints and Multiples talk, I remembered this publication by David Krut Publishing called Deborah Bell's Alchemy. And when we think of prints, that is what it's all about. There is something chemical about the whole process, but there's also a lot of magic. And in that particular publication, there is a wonderful photograph of Deborah working on a plate here, and with a print that we will come back to at the back there. And she worked with David Krut at the time, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our surprise visitor today, David Krut. Initially, I thought I'd introduce him as a serial entrepreneur because he has galleries and bookshops and printing studios in Johannesburg and in Cape Town and in Chelsea, New York, but I thought that would be unfair, completely unfair, because he's actually what is known as a print publisher. And the print publisher does about 50% of the work going into making a print. So David, I want you to talk about the work that you've done with Deborah. Here you are with her in the studio. Tell us about all of that.
Thanks, Wilhelm, and hello to everybody. Am I loud and clear?
Yes.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you can go on.
Oh, good. Well, the story with Deborah goes back to the year 2000. I'd met her previously on my visits to South Africa, and I started working a lot with William Kentridge in '92 and became familiar with his circle of friends. And Deborah had done a very large work with the Artist Proof Studios. It was a diptych, but it was actually proving much too big for them to be able to print. And I was sending, I think it was William Kentridge's Casper's Full of Love plate, because the same thing, William had created this work, this huge plate, and it was so demanding to edition it. And he'd made it at Pretoria University where they have this big press, and he wasn't sure how many he had done, but he asked if I could send it to the workshop with which I'd collaborated for a long time. It was called 107 Workshop, and a man called Jack Sheriff, who sadly is no longer alive. So professionally, it started with Deborah with this diptych we called Diary. It was very complicated. It was called, there was a Diary 1, there was Diary 3, and Diary 4. And Diary 3 was a separate print, and Diary 4 was a separate print, but Diary 1 was the two of them together. So that was quite fascinating, and I really enjoyed interacting with her. And she then went over to complete the edition and work with Jack, because there was a lot of colored sheen calais on the works, which were very big. And she created another 2 prints as well. So this was the thing about Jack Sheriff. He always worked large. And I mean, he was even able to get William to work with color. And obviously, Deborah loved that. And so she, when that continued, which was, I think that was the end of what she did. But then I opened a print workshop unintentionally or unexpectedly in 2002. I mean, only a fool can open a print workshop when he's not a printer. But I had this man I collaborated with abroad, and he came and he set it up. And this is a the beginning is a great photograph, because this is what I like to say, where it was the beginning of the Parkwood art strip. You might say the east side of it, because Goodman had been there a long time. But in this one space, which was just below the service station, we had a book publishing activity, a print workshop activity, a bookstore, a gallery, and an educational program. In fact, I had Sean O'Toole on Saturday mornings used to give people writing lessons. And you can see Deborah there now working on a set of prints with the man whose back is Phil Sanders, who's just produced the most extraordinary book on printmaking, which has just come out. And in the far right corner, you'll see Jill Ross. So Jill had come, she'd just met a South African guy, rolled up in Joburg, and she'd studied art. So she joined us, and we had Deborah coming in. I'd invited David Hockney's etcher, a man called Morris Payne, to come and work at our workshop. And in fact, he ended up working at Artist Proof Studios, and he did some sugarloaf prints. But all of it boiled down to the fact that we had the shop and we had no printer. And there was a chap called Tim Foles who'd been working down at Rhodes. And so I took him on as a printer. And of course, the idea was to make large prints. I'd sort of been infected by Jack Sheriff, who, where he'd done the print of William Kentridge's Sleepers, which was 2 meters by 1 meter. So everything really had to be bigger and better. And that's where, in fact, the ocean is becoming the fish came about. So this isn't the plate of it, but basically what was wonderful about Deborah, she loved to work on the floor, and with big plates, she needed to do that especially as well. And she was very much really, she loved making, dry point is a great speciality. Quite a phenomenal draftsperson, and just loves working in copper plates, and has had, at that stage, had already had at least 10 years experience. So this is an example. I can't quite see, I don't think that print was actually, oh, sorry, that is the press bed. So what has happened on the left side, you can see her working on a plate, putting down a ground or a block out. And then what would have happened is when that plate was treated in such a way that that area's white became exposed, whereas the rest of the area was blocked out. And then that area would be put into an etching solution for a period of time. In this case, it would have been quite extensive because you can see how black that image is when it's printed. And then the plate would be laid down on the bed, the paper would be soaked, and then dry, sort of dusted off a bit, laid over the plate, and the press would go over that. And so you see that wonderful magic moment in a workshop as the print is being lifted away from the copper plate. And of course, for the artists, they've got no idea really what's coming out, because the print's going to print back to front. So they really are taking a lot of chances. They gamble when they do that. And in the case also of text, it prints back to front. So in the case of this, I think Deborah's work it's actually, the words are back to front. She did, no, I'm wrong. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see they are correct. So she actually wrote, and it was etched into that place back to front, and that's how it would print out. And the idea of the scraping is always intentional. That's a particularly fine copper plate, which is really polished. Most of the works we work when we don't really do that, but she wanted that. But even then, the slightest indent, grain or whatever would leave a mark. And you can see that work on the right has some little areas, which in fact are little splashes of water, or down at the bottom, the scratches, which she did intentionally. And there at the bottom left is this the fish. You never ask an artist about the content, and nor do you ever try to tell people about the content. Our role is to explain who the artist is, why we work with them, what we do, and hopefully develop a long-term relationship with them, which, in the case of Kentridge, it's 30 years, in the case of Deborah's 20 years. And that's what it is to be a publisher. But,
Now, David,
but I
try
think
and
the thing is,
explain this one to us. I know you don't want to get involved in the meaning of the word, but how about this one? The ocean is becoming the fish. Have a go.
I thought I'd do some research on it, but I then said, well, no, hang on. I think, I don't have a broad enough sort of appreciation of the way Deborah thinks. Deborah is very much a poet. The use of words, I mean, also the aspect of I suppose, who she sees she is, the things she's read, and awareness of her own spirituality is the strength, is the biggest strength of what she creates in her imagery. So, sorry, I can't really give you a story.
No,
maybe
you
could research that another time. So this was this is a very, very large plate. And why I remember this chap, why I mentioned this chap, Tim Foles, is Joel Ross, who subsequently became his manager and became someone who I worked with for 17 years as the master printer and workshop manager. He was bigger and stronger. And so, as you can see, the scale, this is a meter 16, 120 by 90. So besides everything else, the copper plate is so heavy. And also the extent of inking up, you've got to realize this entire plate would have been inked up in black and then wiped away, which is not really understood. How it seems crazy that you're going to cover the whole thing and then wipe it away. So it's an extreme reductive application, and the artist and the printer really needs to have a good understanding of what the artist is wanting. So you have that process of the proofs, and you have what we call the bon à tirer, or the okay to print, and that is the contract between the printer and the artist, that the printer will try and recreate that image as it is. But when you're working on this scale, that is never going to be the case. And I like that, because to me, each print should really be a variation. But this, it was a small edition. It was 15, and it was the beginnings of a very active workshop. And then what happened was, as we became better and better, and we then enjoyed William coming through regularly, but he became more and more ambitious. And so in 2010, we moved the workshop from Parkwood to Arts on Main, and we were the pioneers there. I think we got there. The idea was us to have the bookstore, and there was a restaurant. Then subsequently, William came along. And so when we opened up, the first artist who came by was Deborah. And that early picture you see was in fact the workshop with only a press in it.
Okay.
And so I think that sort of covers it. But yeah. I think the great thing, we've recently done quite a few series with her. The other great thing that I've enjoyed with Deborah, she's really worked at 5 different locations where I published the work. She worked in New York. She's worked at both of our shops. So she's very adaptable. A lot of artists are quite nervous going into workshops, because suddenly they got people looking at what they're doing. They're working in a public arena, and a lot of them often decide, no, they don't want to really come back, because it's so laborious. And often to do an edition of a print, it can take, I don't know, a month or 2 to do the proofing. Then of course, what happens is the plate, which has then been originated, has to be editioned. That's laborious. That can take another couple of months. And finally, about sort of 6 months, maybe after the origination of the plate, the work is available. And then, of course, it's going to take a long time for the work to sell. And the way we work with our artists, they tend to be, we like to handle all the editions ourselves, because if you give the artist the edition, they end up, it's works on paper. They are not able to look after them the way we are able to in our workshops and in our galleries. They also then get the pricing all right, or wrong, I should say, because one of the most important things in assisting an artist in their career, and which is what I've enjoyed as the publisher, was to try and provide a body of work where an artist can be giving a show to a gallery, and there may be 5 or 10 unique pieces, but they're 10 or 15 or 20 edition works. And I learned that a lot because in the early 80s, when I started my career, I worked very closely with a brilliant publisher who handled David Hockney's work. And in fact, my career was really based on Hockney, his work, because he was such a great etcher. And it was this moment of change when I sort of looked at his work and said, you know, why am I looking at this work and seeing more than just these few lines? So that was really how the career began. But the idea of helping the artist then to augment and have more work available, so a gallery all over the world could have a bigger show. And that's really the role of the publisher. The dilemma is really most galleries get very territorial. They don't, I just want to work with the artist. I don't want an intermediary. So you get very maligned, but we don't give up. We sort of carry on, and we love what we do because things come into the world because of us, and you know, and we're so involved in their careers that we see the artists much more than the galleries would normally get to see.
Okay, David, that is that's fascinating. Don't go away. I will be calling on you a little later, but I just want to continue talking a little bit about prints and multiples. And I want to call Andy Warhol the grandfather of screen printing. He was born in Pittsburgh. He trained as a commercial artist, and of course, screen printing was the standard method that all those artists used to make those big billboards and what have you. This is a screen print of Mao. It is part of a series of 10 works. Mao Zedong, you must remember, this is the 1960s when the Cultural Revolution happened with devastating effects in China. And I think it was part of the Cold War, and I think this was his comment on that. Another print we have on sale is this one of the Brooklyn Bridge. Andy Warhol was very fond of working with the New York skyline. And this one is also part of another series of images of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I'm also reminded of this particular installation of the Empire State Building. This happens to be in Dia Beacon. Those of you who have never been, please, next time you're in New York, take the Northern Line to Beacon, the little town upstate, and go to one of the most wonderful museums in the whole wide world. And this is Andy Warhol's installation of the Empire State Building. Now, if Andy Warhol is the grandfather of screen printing, the father of South African screen printing is certainly Walter Battiss. Now, this is one of his orgies. It is a screen print. He did 5 in the series, and when they were first exhibited in 1973 in Pietermaritzburg, the police were called in and they closed down the exhibition. So, here you are. And for those of you who are new collectors, here are the other 4. So I think it's always nice to have a complete set. So you might as well start with this one and look for these ones. Also look at the absolute freshness of the color. Now, this is another thing about prints and multiples. You need to look after them. Don't hang them in direct sunlight. And if you can, put on museum glass that cuts out 95% of the UV rays when you frame them. He was the father of South African printmaking, and I'm just listing a couple of facts here. He made this first screen print in 1956, and you see an image of that in on the left-hand side. The first artist book, Nisos, contains something like 54 screen prints. He was the first artist with a solo exhibition of screen prints only at UNISA in 1971. He organized the first group show of screen prints in 1972. And he also collected South African prints by Black artists, mainly from Rorke's for the UNISA art collection. So truly the father of South African screen printing. Now, the topic is prints and multiples. This is a multiple. It's a tapestry. It's called People in Love with Trees, and this one is editioned the artist's proof. There, as far as I know, there are 3 that the Marguerite Stevens studio wove, and this happened to be the artist's proof. And I think, given the environmental crisis in which the world finds itself, this is something really to take seriously. I mentioned Rorke's Drift here because Battiss was in fact the external examiner for many years for the printing department at Rorke's Drift. And we are very fortunate to have this particular print by John Mafongezhu, and it's called Zululand Natal, where the art school is. And he carves out the title at the bottom here. And this is, in fact, what his impressions of that. This, by the way, is the river flowing through that. And I also happen to have a photograph of that. There you see the river with the missionary station here and the famous hill there. And I think Mafongezhu was probably standing there at the back, looking across the river to this particular scene. Now, the printmaking studio, here are some examples of Battiss here in conversation with one of the students, Woman Corsi Zulu, and they are discussing how to make etchings here, a group of students here. Woman Corsi liked his hat so much that he appropriated it for the purposes of this particular photograph. The whole story of the Rorke's Drift painting department, well documented by Philippa Hobbs and Elizabeth Rankin in this book, Rorke's Drift Empowering Prints. And we have some of the other artists, some of the other printmakers, such as Eric Mabatas, Jacob and the Angel, also on the sale. Battiss, of course, very friendly with Norman Catherine. They collaborated on the lengthy Fook Island project. And here you have very large scale screen prints by Norman Catherine. And this one is called Hodgepodge. The Hodge there referring to Robert Hodgins with his 5 o'clock shadow there and some bits of paint on the face after a hard day's work. I'm also showing you this, the same scale, quite large scale work. And I'm showing you this simply because you can see the difference in texture between a print, such as this screen print, and a painting by Norman Catherine, such as this one, and even a tapestry, a small scale tapestry here. So it's all about the texture. Printmaking is all about the unique texture that a printmaker or an artist can achieve in the prints. Well, if Battiss is the father of printmaking, then the grandfather must surely be J.H. Pirniev. He started printmaking in 1909, and he worked with that through the early years. And you can see the very strong graphic quality of the black and white and the phenomenal manner in which he could manipulate space and form. Very popular among new collectors. And to date, 2 books published on his printmaking. The first one, 1974, by Nieland, who documented the printed woodcuts. And in 2015, that book was updated by Gerard de Kamper and Chris de Klerk. They added quite a number of images unknown to Nieland, which brings the total to 220 of these liner cuts. And Gerard and Chris also included his etchings, which is quite unique for their particular book. I'm back with Battiss, and this time in the 1970s, and with Cecil Scottness, the 2 of them formed the foundation of African Council for Arts in 1971. Here we have an example of a portfolio, Man's Gold, poems by Stephen Gray, and then the prints by Cecil Scottness. In the 1990s, you have the Artmore phenomenon, and we are very fortunate to have quite a number of prints published by the Caversham Press, Malcolm and Ross Christian, with those artists trying their hands out at essentially designs. Look at the elephant and the stork here, because surely this inspired a lovely ceramic work by Bonnie and Charlie, elephant hugging a stork there. There's another example, Mavis Shabalala, angel with animals, a punch Shabalala, the magic with animals, and Bonakele or Bonnie and Charlie, a self-made print such as this one. And I like this sort of array of intermingling animals because some of the art, more ceramic artists, then took up that whole idea. And here you have a bird with a snake in its beak. This is probably my favorite, a Bonnie and Charlie print, Daniel in the Lion's Den, because I love the flat, big surfaces here. And in my mind, this inspired another ceramic artist, Noira Mabasa, to make a work such as this. That brings us to William Kentridge. David mentioned him before, and we're very fortunate to have this large-scale work, News from Nowhere. And this was when Kentridge received the commission to design and direct the 1928 Dmitri Shostakovich opera, The Nose, for the Metropolitan Opera House in New York in 2011. And the title refers to the 1836 Nikolai Gogol's short story, The Nose. And Kentridge made, it really inspired him, that whole commission. And he made numerous drawings and prints and video installations and tapestries and small sculptures, in which he began to think about, to map out the iconography of the opera production. And here is Shostakovich behind the piano, and Kentridge integrated it, that image in one of the video installations. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the story, The Nose, the short story, it is an absurd tale of a minor official or middle-aged ranking Russian bureaucrat, collegiate assessor Kovalyov, who wakes up one morning to find his nose has disappeared. In the course of the morning, he tries to locate and attach his nose again, citing it all around St. Petersburg, first as a much higher ranking officer going into a church, then as a heroic equestrian figure proudly sitting on horseback. And at the end of the Gogol story, Kovalyov wakes up another morning to find that his nose is back in place. On his face, the nose, disguised as a gentleman about to abscond in a stagecoach, was arrested by a policeman and returned in a jar full of vodka, purportedly in order to preserve it to its rightful owner. And this is the stage set that Kentridge then designed for the Metropolitan Opera. I'm just showing you a couple lovely black and white and red this collage work of a gigantic nose, some of the singers, and he even designed the costumes here together with Greta Goiras. And this work featured on one of the Johannesburg art fairs some years ago. And I mentioned that he made video installations about what inspired him for the Nose opera. The most famous one probably this, I'm Not Me, The Nose Is Not Mine. And he installed that at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. And when you walked into the room, you are confronted with no fewer than 6 large-scale screens on which completely different narratives were told. And you were bombarded by visual detail, such as these, with progressions, with equestrian figures. I'm interested in this one, in the manner in which Kentridge then used collage bits of paper to articulate figures, because this reminds me of another work we have on auction here, Almost Don't Worry. I'm showing you this one because of what happens to the horse there. Again, Kentridge uses bits of paper to articulate the different movements of the horse here. And here is what a noseless face, I think, would look like. But I'm showing you this simply for us to understand what is happening in this print called Four Shadows, with the bits of the horse and Kentridge manipulating and articulating that. The equestrian figure you see over here, and the nose, he also made, as I mentioned, these little sculptures, such as this one of the nose. He gave a series of lectures on that. And then I think David also printed a series of 30 etchings. This is what they all look like. I've just grouped them together in one slide, but fascinating series. And this is part of that. Another print we have on the sale, Horseman this time. Books, many books. This is the catalogue of an exhibition in Zurich. Tapestries, I mentioned tapestries. And again, look at the texture of these tapestries. That is very different. The texture is very different to that texture that Kentridge obtained in his print. Now, our print is part of a pair, and they were made first for an exhibition in Sydney, in Australia. And on that same exhibition, a number of the other small-scale prints, and this particular nose one. Now, David also mentioned Casper's Full of Love, the large-scale print here. And David, do you want to tell us a little bit about this one? Okay, while we're waiting for David.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
Yes, I think what happened was, I think William wanted to make very, very large etchings. I think he had a small press at his disposal, and the University of Pretoria has this huge press, which in fact is where Diane Victor does a lot of her work. So what William did was he undertook to give a series of lectures in Pretoria so that they'd allow him to actually make this and print this edition. But I think it was so laborious and so difficult, it was so big, and I think also, I think he might even have run out of that particular paper as well. So he thinks he did about 17 of them, and the plate was lying in his studio. And so when I suggested that he should really complete the edition because it's such an incredibly important work, he agreed, and the plate was packed, and as I say, together with 2 plates of Deborah's and sent to Jack Sheriff. And the idea was to try and replicate the paper. I can't remember exactly the name just offhand. So there were certain trial proofs done, which are on a white paper, but the one he really wanted was the cream paper. And so the edition was completed. And I can't recall whether he was over in England and signed the edition there, or the prints all came back to Joburg for him to sign. But we completed the edition, I think, assuming 18 onwards. So I'm not sure what number this edition is.
Okay.
If you look in your auction catalog, okay, whether it's from the series printed.
Yeah. Okay. Just
to tell you, what is your edition number?
Yeah.
Lot 505. In fact, it's a printer's proof. Okay. And that's, that's a little bit of a mystery. I can't remember if William did the printer's proofs, but they were done at Jack Sheriff at 107 Workshop. And yeah, that was the story of them. Of course, it's his most political image, I would say, relating, to the Caspers. And I'm sure people know the story, but he was listening to the radio in the bad old days, and there was Force's Favorite, which was a radio program, which I think you mentioned. And the mother was sending her son Casper's Full of Love to say how much she missed him. And he overheard that, and I think it's sat in his brain. Maybe that's why he wanted to go and make such a large print, because that's, you might say, an overhead view of a Casper with the top off. And a lot of people.
And then the word Casper, of course, is an amalgam of the South African Police and the Council for Research and Industrial Research. So that's where that word comes from. And he also mentions, you know, that the inspiration of the heads came from drawings he made of Giotto figures in Santa Croce in Tuscany. The heads somehow got separated from their bodies, and so he landed up with a number of heads with missing bodies. And they are also inspired by an exhibition of Tony Craig's wonderful beet heads, bronze cast of beetroots with crude faces carved into them. But I like your explanation of the soldiers crammed into one of those armored personnel carriers. Okay, talking of politics, multiples are in the form of photographs, and we have a wonderful collection of those by Jürgen Schadeberg, who sadly died earlier on this year, Orlando Township, 1951. Remember, this was the time of the forced removals when the apartheid government came into power. And you have the Defiance campaign in Johannesburg, 1952. You also have photographic artists such as George Hallett here, working with imagery of the time of the 1960s. The penny whistleblower, Robert Sitole. And this one reminds me of the Sam Mgetwa lithograph that Mark Atwood printed some years ago. Another example before the forced removals at District 6, and a very suave Nelson Mandela there. And also what I really like, images of Dumile Feni, because these images of him are as rare as hen's teeth. And here he captures him in his studio with a drawing on the easel, and even Peter Clark. So quite wonderful images of fellow artists made there. And that brings us to one of the best prints on the whole auction, and that is William Kentridge's Dutch Iris. Now, I initially thought, you know, where does this Dutch Iris fit into his oeuvre? Because it doesn't appear very often. And I initially thought that he might have gotten it from Dürer, Albrecht Dürer, because these are Albrecht Dürer watercolors, absolutely phenomenal works. And as you also well know, that there was an exhibition, it is called Double Vision, where Dürer prints were juxtaposed with Kentridge prints. And I thought I will definitely find the irises there, not so. And I had to look somewhere else. And that somewhere else was an early opera, The Return of Ulysses, that he staged in Brussels, in Belgium in 1998. And that opera was based on the 1641 Monteverdi opera. And he did that in collaboration with the Handspring Puppet Company. Now, what you're looking at is really one of those anatomy setups that was so popular in the 17th century, with the viewers looking at the cadaver on the slab there. And that is where Ulysses would have been lying, and then everything would go through his mind. He was on his way back after the wars to Penelope, his wife of 20 years in the waiting. And these images would go through his heart and his mind. And these are some of the images that would have been projected on that screen there. The pumping heart there, the circulation of blood through the body was just discovered when Monteverdi composed the opera in 1641. So you have that image, and then the heart turns into an iris. There you have the iris. And then the iris would turn into this tree man. And of the iris, Kentridge says, and here I've reproduced the muscle of the human heart. I penetrated, and this is a letter to the director of this particular opera. I penetrated through the drawing as if it were a laser operation, and the journey in the vessels transforms it into a raging sea. And here's the iris, which symbolizes Penelope. Its petals slowly unfurl and then close again. And so you have the iris really symbolizing early motherhood, you know, symbolizing a woman who was just given birth. Here are other images there. So it's not only the heart turning into an iris, it's also the head. You can see a cross section through the brain there, and the brain mass, nothing else but the iris. And so that reminded me, David, when I saw this, I remember seeing this in your gallery in Parkwood. Now tell us about that, because that is absolutely fascinating.
Well, it sort of remains clear in my mind. I met William in May 1992 at what was then the Market Theatre Gallery, Ricky Burnett, and he was going over to the UK for a show with Richard Branson's sister, Vanessa Deborah, so she was called then. And so I said to him, why don't you go and visit this workshop with which I collaborate? You can do very large works, and you can you can use color. And William had actually just come back from a sort of sabbatical in Italy, and he was given pigments, and I think he was struggling what to do with the color. But in any event, he went over to Jack, and of course he made about 10 plates, and one of them was the Dutch iris, which was intending to consist of 4 copper plates. And the work you have on the right is really Dutch Iris 1, which was the first plate that that William agreed with Jack on what he wanted the colors to look like. A lot of them, those images William had created them as torn sheets of paper when he'd made unique works. So it was, of course, taking advantage of color was something he'd never had a chance to do. So you see close up there of all the recipes that were required to get the colors, because they didn't just come out of a tube or out of a tub. They were mixed. So you can see then again also, if you look at the top right, it says there white RS over tip. So that was an instruction to remind the printer and his assistant how they would ink up these plates, because then again, there would be all the color and which would have to be reduced. I mean, on the left, you'll see Finster RS over RS, I think it's the color, over blue and couple on stripes. So there was also there, you saw William applying acid to get those brush marks. That green area there shows just uncontrolled biting, just putting ink onto the plate. And then you can see also lower down, finger out. So that round semicircle there, when that would be inked up, would have to be inked in a very specific way. So the first plate remained intact, and that would be inked up. And there were then the other plates that came into play. Originally, William had 4 plates in mind, and fortunately one we decided not to use. But the registration, of course, of 3 plates is incredibly difficult. So the one other plate was the line plate. And I think the other plate, if you go back, is if we can just look at that image. I can't quite recall, but you'll see when you look at the final image, that has all 3 plates together, and you can see the line plates introduced if you go back again. So a lot of this work, each one of them is really very different. Each one is incredibly complicated. And from this series, the plates that William made were so brilliant that I felt it would be a shame that there would only be an edition of 3 together. So what happened is then each of these single plates were editioned separately. So there was then also, there was Dutch Iris 2, and there was White Iris, and then then he totally reworked the one plate, and I can't remember what it's called now, but that was, so from this particular project came 4 different editions. But at the same time, as I say, William did these incredible images, which were the head, which exists in 2 states, and also the general, which where he used a Dremel, a drill, to work into a Perspex sheet. So as they took, so some of these works, if they're correctly dated, really were done in 93, but finally published in 1998, when all the editions were complete. And that's when I did the first show of William's work in America, in Chicago, where I was able to present all these editions, plus that great series of Ubu prints, which had been done at Caversham. And from that, a lot of museum collections in the Midwest acquired William's work and became aware of his work.
Fascinating, fascinating, David. We're getting to the end. We also
Can I just give you one little piece of information? When you're just going back to the nose, the fact that, you know, William was commissioned, don't worry about the print. It was just in fact, he was actually commissioned in about 2006 or 2007. So he had 3 years to work towards the final performance in 2010. And in that period, he worked continually. And that's how long it took to produce those 30 images. They were dated, that there were progressions all the way through. And when he started, he actually didn't have much idea of what the opera was going to look like. So he found his postcards, or he found he was always interested in Tapman's Tower, and he did images of that. And it was only about halfway through when he realized what the storyline and what the sets would look like that he finished those editions, the images at the bottom.
Thanks for that. So then the last print I want to show is this one, large scale work, and clearly inspired by one of William's favorite artists, Manet, as you can see from the still life on the right. And it reminds me of that wonderful reading room installed at the retrospective at Zeitz-Mocha last year, such as you have here. And again, you have the iris over there. And I think, yeah, that brings us to the end of this. Thank you very much, David. And if there are questions for David or for me, please, do we have the chat function, Arisha?
Yes, there's a chat function, or you're welcome to unmute your mic. Okay.
Okay.
I think everybody's overwhelmed with information, Wilhelm. I also must congratulate you, Wilhelm. It's a brilliant piece of choreography and art history that you put together. And of course, you've got a wonderful auction coming up with some incredible works. Congratulations, Strauss Art.
Yeah, thank you. And I love your backdrop with all the books. Now all my colleagues would know where I get all my Kentridge books from.
Thank you, Bella. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. If you missed any parts, this will be uploaded onto YouTube shortly. So is all the other talks that we've done. We're coming close to our sale. The wine starts on Sunday. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the catalogue or come to our offices, please do pop by. And if there is any questions that you think of later, you're more than welcome to email us. Otherwise, have a good evening. Thank you again, David and Wilhelm. It was a very wonderful talk, and we appreciate all of your knowledge. Okay, I'll end off here. Thank you.